Welcome to Main Street Podcast, an opportunity to talk to Idaho's elected leaders about the issues that matter to you. Welcome to the Main Street Idaho Podcast. I'm your host, Brennan Summers, and we are here with one of our favorites, Representative Josh Wheeler out of District 35, which covers Ammon, Teton County, all the way down the Wyoming border, takes in Soda Springs, Montpelier, the whole bit. So, Representative Wheeler, we're really glad that you found some time to chat with us today.
Well, always happy to get a chance to chat with you, Brendan. And don't forget Eastern Bannock County also. I get 5 counties. It's my great privilege.
Oh, man, we would have had some very upset people from Bannock County if you wouldn't have corrected me. Thank you for that. Now, you're a busy man these days, Josh. So not only do you sit on 3 committees in the House, and are a busy legislator. This is as you're completing up your first term. Your full-time job, your regular job outside of that, is you help run your locally owned family business. You're now have responsibility over your local church congregation. You've got 6 kids, and I mean, it never ends with you. How do you possibly find the time to prioritize the things you need to?
You make it sound like I should be concerned, Brendan, when you lay that all out. The honest truth is, for me, it's all about finding the right team and delegating. My team at my electrical contracting firm is incredibly competent, and they work hard for me to be able to take take care of these other jobs, whether it be in the legislature or whether it be with the church or the community, like you say. I mean, so it really is just about having the right team and supporting them.
Yeah, and there is no need for concern. I firmly believe that if you want something done, you give it to the busiest person you know, because they know how to get things done. So this is actually an invitation to put more on your plate. You've got some bills you're working through in the legislature right now. I'd love to get into those a little bit later, but you actually had a big, busy week. You filed for re-election this week, right?
I did, yes, down at the Secretary of State's office.
Was that a difficult decision, Josh?
Honestly, no. I feel like we had such a great first term, and we put some really important things in motion, whether it be some new and improved CTE programs, whether it be the way that we've been able to support our local law enforcement and support programs for improved roads and bridges. I mean, we've put that stuff in place, and I just felt like we need to ask the people if we can go back and finish the job. And so, I made the decision months ago, really, and it was just more than anything a fun formality to go down and file this past week.
Yeah, I wish I would have placed some money on the over-under of how far into this podcast episode until your favorite 3 letters CTE came out. I don't think we made it a minute in, but and that's, of course, something we'll need to talk about, but we know how much career technical education is important to you. It is a formality to file to run. You have to go and kind of check the box, and I know that was a decision that you talked about with your family and decided whether or not to do this again. As I talk to elected leaders, both on the podcast and just in regular life, there's so many different reasons on why people run. And I think it's at the core, most of our elected leaders think that they can improve our society and that their talents and experience lend itself to the position. And that's why they kind of throw their hat in the ring. And I'm sure that's true of you. But in our conversations, there's something a little deeper. And it goes back to a debt that you owe the community. And I apologize because I didn't plan on asking you this, and you haven't been prepped with this. And if I'm crossing boundaries here, you feel free to say, next question, Brennan. But I think it'd be helpful for our listeners to hear a little bit about how when your family was at their darkest and lowest point and the community came to bear you up, that really tough experience and seeing where the community was for someone in need propelled you into elected office.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my good legislative colleagues, they do this for their families, they do this for their communities, and it's been just over 5 years ago that we lost one of our 6 kids to a brain tumor. And you've described it beautifully. It was that my community absolutely was there for us bore us up. They supported my kids when we couldn't. They supported us when nobody could. And I just felt this deep sense. It really is a debt, Brennan. I don't think I've ever described it that way. I felt this deep sense that I needed to find a way to give back to my community. And so every day when I wake up and put this on, I want to make sure that I am being the kind of person representing the kind of community that raised me and that has supported me. And so, yeah, that very much is the reason why. And it's the reason why we're coming back and we're asking for the community to send us back next year and continue to represent them.
So in the legislature, you're not exactly delivering meals directly to a neighbor who's mourning, and you're not shoveling their walk. But on a more grand scale, you are serving. How is it that, help us understand the lens in which you view your time in these three committees and proposing bills, and what seems distant and wonky is actually service to the people of Bannock County, the people of Ammon, the people of Teutonia.
Yeah, I mean, part of the service is just being willing to be present and to listen, to hear. I actually got to present to one of my daughter's nursing classes this week and talk about public policy and talk about the way that these energized, engaged young people could, make a difference in the process. And I just talked about how a lot of it is being willing to show up. It's being willing to ask one more question, right? It's being willing to just hear one more presentation, or to in my case, read one more bill, or try to understand one more set of policies and procedures. And one of the things that I think I learned from my community, right, is trust, and is being open and being vulnerable, and that's what has really helped me to be able to work with some quality legislators over here, and make some tough decisions that end up, they end up affecting things like our small businesses, whether it be something wonky like unemployment taxes. As much as anything, what we're trying to do is make sure that the government stays out of the way as much as possible and supports our local families, keeps them safe, keeps our communities healthy, and lets people flourish in the state of Idaho.
Trust is something that I'm really hanging on to here as you bring that up, because it really is a public trust. When we give our vote to somebody, they have our trust, and our hope is that they go and act in a way and do the things that they had promised and indicated that they would do. And there's nothing more frustrating than when we hear stories about legislators who over in the Capitol, pull a colleague aside and are screaming at them and cussing at them, or deals that are done that were contrary to integrity or what we thought would be done. And that's frustrating to the constituents. That's frustrating to me as a voter. Now, none of us are guilt-free of losing our temper, raising our voices, especially when it comes to the passionate things you're working on. But walk us through what your philosophy and leadership is when it comes to whether it be your home, whether it be your workplace, whether it be the halls of Congress. How can you say, look, you can trust me as a leader because this is the way I view leadership?
Well, let me start, Brennan, by talking about the dinner table at the Wheeler household. I think I've told this story before, but years ago we built this giant, oversized table, that now almost can't fit my whole family. You can get 12 people around it, but with another wedding coming down the pipeline this August, we may have a harder time fitting everybody around it. But one of the things that I've always strove for, and one of the things that my wife and I have always tried to do, is we've tried to, contrary to what they say out there, we've tried to be open to talk about anything, meaning politics, religion, sex, the whole nine yards. We want to make sure that our kids felt safe to come and bring us questions, bring us conversations. And so, honestly, my philosophy was listen, then listen again, and then ask a question so that I could listen to understand where my kids were coming from. I try to do the same thing with where my constituents may be coming from, where my fellow legislators may be coming from. And sometimes that's most valuable when I find someone who has a differing opinion than me. They're the most informed to help me understand and potentially see things from another position. So I just believe it's so important as a leader to be willing to listen. And then when it's time to go do the work, go get it done.
Yeah, I think listening is a very undervalued trait, I think, across the board. And I hate when I hear the phrase, I just can't imagine how somebody would think that way. Because when you come from that perspective, you can't imagine why somebody would think that way, then that's a problem. And it sounds like at your dinner table, you're trying to understand why somebody could think that way.
Yeah, and my sweetheart, she often hears me say, especially since I've gotten, into this role, if I believed the way that person believes, I could understand why they were coming at it from that angle or why they felt like that's what needed to be done. I don't necessarily believe that, but I want to go ask them, one more question. I want to see if I can get to know and understand them a little better, right? And again, there's really almost no topic off limit at the Wheeler household other than cheating at board games. That's a non-starter, okay?
Well, it helps that your wife's a lot smarter than the average American. So shout out to Laramie for being significantly smarter than her plus one.
Yes,
She
yes.
she gets to elevate the level of conversation. Now, speaking of differing opinions, one of the important roles you have as a legislator is you go to the House floor or in committee and you vote. It's a very basic thing where in a republic we elect you to vote on behalf of us. I don't walk into Boise and decide issues of unemployment tax. You decide that for us. When it comes to how you decide to vote, I imagine that you've taken some difficult votes. You only get a yes or no, yay or nay. There's not, well, this bill's mostly good, but there's some stuff in it I can't support, or there's a better bill coming, or this is a key to helping us accomplish something else. It's yes and no, and you have such a diverse geographical district. Certainly, there are issues where your constituents differ, and you have to decide, well, who do I listen to, and where do I go? Representative, walk us through how you make decisions when it comes to votes on the floor of the House.
Boy, Brennan, that is a great question. And it's funny, again, when I was talking with my daughter's classmates this week, one of the questions they asked me was, do you really read all those emails that you get? Because we do get a lot of them, and they were just wanting to know, how do I best engage with a representative or a legislator? And I talked about how, a phone call is of more value than an email. And obviously a face-to-face conversation, if you can manage it, is of greater value than that. But what I did explain to them was that when I'm going through emails on any bill, first of all, I need to see, is that person from good old District 35? Because that's the opinion that I value most, right? And then, of course, I've got to go back to my core principles, right? What does the Idaho Constitution say? What does the United States Constitution say? And after that, I have to say, what has the conversation at the Wheeler family dinner table been for all these 26 years that we've been together? How does that inform how I feel about this bill or that bill, right? And obviously, like you talked about, Brendan, the hardest ones are when I hear from constituents back home, and some are on one side of the issue and some are on the other side of the issue. And so I listen as best I'm able to those, but in the end, I have to make the decision. I have to be responsible. And I've said to Laramie before, there are some yes votes that are a higher percentage yes than others, but just like you said, that doesn't show up on the board. And I may take a vote because I know there's a better bill coming, right? Or I may take a vote because I see some unintended consequences that maybe I haven't heard about from my constituents, right? So in the end, it comes back to my core principles after I've listened as best I'm able.
You talk core principles. I want to push you on that one because unfortunately in this day and age, sometimes we vote just simply on likability. Sometimes we vote on party, and sometimes we vote on, how close you are to a certain national political candidate. But you're saying, the biblical judge me by my fruits of how I vote in the legislature and my core principles. What are some of those core principles that can't be negotiated away for Josh Wheeler?
Well, I mean, honestly, family above all, honestly, Brennan. Like, and so how it affects my family, or what it might do to my community, first and foremost, is what affects my decision, right? After that, obviously, I'm talking about things like, what does it do to personal freedoms, right? And then how does it affect our free market, our small businesses? I mean, small businesses are the backbone of Idaho's economy. And if you look at it, a lot of times those small businesses are just a family. They're just a couple of individuals. They're a mom and a dad, especially on our farms, who have, for 5, 6, 7 generations, have made sure that we have food on our plates in Idaho. And have to keep in mind, how is this going to affect them? So I think those are some of my core principles.
Yeah, I love that. My roommate's from Montpelier, my old college roommate, and I mentioned him when we were on with Mark Harris, and I got in trouble because he said, "Stop talking about me on the podcast." But he's one of these guys, one of your constituents in Montpelier, who the tax bill comes and he, decides, how am I going to make this work? And it's feeding cows and selling cows and sorting that all out, and that the fluff and the arguments and everything else that goes on in the halls of the legislature are just less important to him than, well, what can the government do to stay out of my business, not get more involved in it? So yeah, right. I'm hearing that. Okay, go back to family above all. I was talking to a friend recently, and she had mentioned that she has a lot of kids in the school system, and she wished she saw more dads involved in things. Now, employment often makes it harder sometimes for fathers to get involved, but there's something to be said about the impact that a father can have in the life of their kids and in the community. As a dad, what message do you say to the fathers out there when it comes to getting involved in the community and in the kids' lives?
Well, what I would honestly say is, don't ever be discouraged. Find any and every way that you can to be involved. I'm like a lot of dads in our community. I've been a coach. I wasn't a great soccer coach, but I did show up to coach, right? I've showed up at, school events. I've showed up at sporting events. In my local elementary school, where my youngest son still attends, they started a program this year to invite dads to come and essentially be present on campus during the day, and they've gotten really great response. And I think you've probably seen news stories about this dads on campus program before. And again, the point is, like, you can do something. You can always do something. And so I would just say, don't be discouraged. Like, my kids get tired of hearing me say the same thing with politics and with, voting. I just tell them all the time, get involved. Honestly, one of the proudest moments I had in the past couple of years is when my oldest daughter, who, was living in another state, attending school, volunteered to be a poll worker in that state, right? Because I think she had heard the message that finding a way to be involved is what matters.
And you're speaking from a place of, I mean, it is somewhat prestigious to bear the responsibility of being a state legislator, but you got involved even when you were doing like grunt work on the Ammon City Council, when most people may not have known your name, but they knew that you bore responsibility of making sure that traffic light got fixed or that their streets got plowed.
Brennan, pushing for the sewer district for the city of Ammon and Shelley and the surrounding counties was one of the greatest things I ever got to do on Ammon City Council. So don't ever sell that short.
I love that for you. As Mr. Sewer District guy, talk us through how your time on the city council in Ammon has prepared you for this.
That's a great question, Brennan. And I would say a couple of the ways it's prepared me is, interesting enough, that's really, for me, was an introduction to sort of parliamentary procedure and some of the rules and procedures that are put in place that kind of protect dialogue and protect the citizens, because there is a process and there is a opportunity for them to give feedback and to be heard, right? And of course, the other way it prepared me is, again, even on the city council, 6 councilors and a mayor, there were plenty of opportunities for disagreement, right? I mean, even if we're talking about number of parking spaces around a planned development, right? Or if we're talking about the sewer district, or if we're talking about, is it time for the city hall to have an expansion? Or It's interesting. I sort of am a little bit grateful that I'm not on the council now, because they're having to talk about, do we need a street levy, right? To kind of responsibly respond to the growth that is happening in our area. But just sort of all of that different dynamic, and again, finding ways to work together, even when I might vote differently than a city council member. I mean, all of that was great preparation for what happens in this building with, a lot more politicians, a lot more legislators, and a lot more good people trying to do the best thing that they can for the citizens of Idaho.
You talk about this dichotomy between staying positive and don't get discouraged, but then you also kind of lean into this idea that disagreement's okay. And I think to some of us, that's a little uncomfortable. This idea of being positive and not getting discouraged should be like mutually exclusive from disagreement. When it comes to conflict in politics, like when you go on the campaign trail and you have people tell you that they don't like the way you voted or they don't agree with the leadership philosophies you've talked about, how do you marry up this idea of staying positive and not getting discouraged when conflict seems inevitable?
So, two things, Brennan. I think you're 100% right. Conflict, just like change, is one of the only guarantees that we have in life, right? It's going to happen. And one of the things I felt like I learned, especially in my first campaign for state legislature, is step away from your social media. It's interesting that Governor Little, even in his state of the state address this year, talked about finding a way to get our kids away from social media. Because what I found is, when I had the privilege to go out and knock on somebody's door, and it might have been somebody that disagreed with me, it might have been somebody that we agreed, 90% on everything. But having a face to face conversation was so much more valuable and so much more energizing, and filled me with more optimism to recognize how much we had in common. How many people just wanted to have safe communities for their kids, who wanted to have strong public schools so that their kids could learn about our great country and our great state, who wanted to have roads and bridges that worked so they could get to school and work and get to all the recreational activities that their families had. I mean, there was more of that in common. And so I felt more energized. I felt more optimistic after I got to talk to people face to face than if I went and spent the same amount of time, doom scrolling and seeing how many people were just angry in that arena. I just find that that's why I'm able to sort of maintain my optimism. And so in some ways I'm spoiled, because I get to go out and have more and more face-to-face interactions with members of my community, whether it's at my schools, whether it's with my church congregation, or again, whether it's around the Wheeler dinner table. And that just fills me with optimism, because people want good things for our state and our country. And you can see it when you go talk to them.
Yeah, so your message is not shy away or suppress disagreement and conflict. It's embrace it at a human level, where we look each other in the eyes and we recognize the humanity in our other world beings out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's be aware that there are now algorithms out there that seek only to generate conflict and discontent, right? And so we've got to be aware of that, overcome it. And one thing that what my oldest daughter always says is, Dad, we cannot let people weaponize apathy, right? Don't let apathy and discouragement keep you from being involved in whatever way you can be involved.
Say that again for us. That was a really good line. What's your daughter teaching us about apathy?
Don't let people weaponize apathy. Don't let that be the reason you stay away.
And I look at our voter turnout numbers over the years, not just the last caucus, but even before. People don't vote. And I don't know how to call it anything other than apathy by not participating. And I get the arguments of, well, we're in Idaho and it's already determined, and because half the people will say I'm only going to vote in the presidential general election, and then the other half will say, well, that it's already determined because we're in Idaho, so I'm only going to vote in the primary. But apathy seems to be prevalent in the political process. You got an answer for it, Josh?
I mean, honestly, Brendan, my answer is just to continue to present an optimistic attitude about it, right? To have the hard conversations, to listen, and I remind people again, when I talked to these students earlier this week, I said, like, sometimes you only win or lose, meaning that attitudes or directions change slightly by, a mere dozens of votes, especially at our local levels, right? And so I just, you'll hear me bang that drum over and over again. Like, we just have got to stay engaged, because that's the way to remain optimistic and to remain energized. And look, sometimes we'll go home at night and we'll take a real deep breath and we'll sink pretty deep into the pillow, but we can get up the next day and we can go forward with that sort of optimistic spirit again.
Man, if this legislature thing doesn't work out for you, I think you should become a weatherman, because you could make a blizzard look like a sunny day. We're loving the optimism here. Let's transition to some things that we can be optimistic about. Representative, walk us through some of the stuff that you are working on in the legislature that you're hoping can get completed before we end, and maybe some of the things that you're proud that have been accomplished this session.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, so a couple of mine personally, Brennan, that I'd love to talk about. Uh, I've got a bill that is creating a provisional license for internationally trained physicians. So these are physicians that were born, raised, trained, practiced as physicians in another country and have immigrated here legally to the United States. And we're going to create a 3-year provisional license for them to come to work in Idaho with their expertise under a supervising Idaho physician. So that's just, it's honestly, in some ways, it's a tiny little tool. It's one more opportunity for Idaho to fill in the gaps that we have in our physician workforce. And so that's going to be heard on the Senate floor, I think, next week. And I've just been super excited to see that one happen. Of course, one of my other personal bills.
I'm going to stop you there and circle back to that one with a couple questions. That's okay. Has that already passed the House?
It's already passed the House, actually with unanimous support. So that was pretty exciting.
Will this largely alleviate some of the physician shortages we're seeing in rural areas?
Well, I won't say that it'll largely alleviate it, but again, it's a tool that can fill some of those holes. Absolutely. I mean, it's funny. I had a great conversation with a local pediatrician after that bill passed out of the House committee, and he told me, I had a trained physician that I worked alongside in my residency, and he said, and he didn't have an opportunity or a way to come to work in Idaho other than he was a translator. And so a lot of times this young resident would be talking to this translator, and he might say, hey, what did you think about that rash? And this guy had all the expertise and could tell him answers, right? And so it's opportunities like that it'll open up. And it's funny, even as I started working on this bill last year, Brennan, I remembered a gentleman from Greece who had immigrated here, married a cute gal from Pocatello, had 4 beautiful kids, and never went back to work directly as a physician because he just didn't have the wherewithal to restart, a med school and a residency program here in Idaho. And so he worked kind of connected to healthcare. He worked at a manufacturer of supplements, but it's just, again, some missed opportunities. And so this will open up some opportunities. And yes, absolutely, it could help our rural physicians workforce.
Well, selfishly, I was at a clinic a couple days ago, hence why I sound like Snuffleupagus over here, and I had to wait 2 hours to see a doctor. So if you can make my wait time shorter at the doctor's office, then I'm all in on it. Now,
we'll check back in a couple of years.
Yeah, no, I was sorry to interrupt you. Let's move on to that other bill you're working on.
Well, so one of the other ones that I got to work on with a more experienced legislator this session was one to basically direct state agencies that when they hire, they do not use a 4-year degree as an arbitrary screening tool. They hire based on skills-based hiring. So I know it's been longer than 10 minutes since we said my favorite 3 letters, but this is going to signal CTE. I mean, this is going to open up hiring for like IT professionals who just have certifications, that make them experts, whether it's in, Cisco or whether it's in Windows or other, esoteric IT things. It's going to open up the window for engineers assistants or for mechanics, right, that we're hiring with our state agencies. So I've been very excited about that bill because even though it's only affecting state agencies, I think it sends a message to our private industry in Idaho. Hey, we do care about CTE. We do care about skills and experience and not just a 4-year degree. So that's one I've been pretty excited about. Before you interrupt me, any questions on that one?
No, go ahead.
So the other one I would talk about, I think that I've been really excited to see, and I heard from a lot of my constituents about this issue before we even came into session. But this is House Bill 521, and it's over on the Senate side, and I know there's a lot of conversation going on around it. But the most important thing that 521 does is it establishes a way for us to send state funds directly to school districts specifically for facility construction and maintenance. And I am all about supporting our public schools and making sure that we find the right way to provide them the funding they need for school facilities. I have the privilege of representing 9 school districts, Brennan. And so obviously there's a variety of different needs. Some have got a lot of what they need facility wise. Some absolutely are like decades out of date, and they are so creative and they're so scrappy and they're so hardworking. But 521 does the right thing, even constitutionally, for us as a state to provide those funds to them so that they can, get what they need done with their facilities. And that's a big deal. And it has a lot of, other elements to it, but that's the thing I'm most excited about with that particular piece of legislation.
Oh, that's fantastic. Now, we know you've got to run to get to the House floor. You've got a busy day ahead. We appreciate you taking some time with us. Last minute words, departing words that you can offer to the constituents, the listeners out there on the importance of voting coming up, on the importance of the primary and what's been happening in the legislature.
Well, I hope 2 words get stuck in everybody's head from this podcast and from any conversation from here to May 21st. But the words are that May matters. It matters so much that our people show up. I said it to this young nursing class. They're all of voting age, and I even several of them were actually registered, which I was excited to see. But we've got to show up, right? May matters. I mean, if you need a contest, if you got that competitive spirit that so many Idahoans have, let's beat the percentage that showed up at our last primary. Let's show up and make sure our voices are heard.
Fantastic. Josh Wheeler, CTE advocate, proud Hillcrest graduate, our dear friend out of District 35, Representative Josh Wheeler. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Brennan.